We've been looking at the development of the church in America. We've looked at a little bit about some of the changes taking place in the Roman church. And we want to take a look now a little bit at what is going on in some of the churches in Europe. And what fascinates me about this is how in the wonderful providence of God, there is so much interconnection of churches from one place to another that we often don't fully realize. For example, the effect of the Great Awakening in America, due to the preaching of Edwards and Whitefield and Wesley, actually led to a very significant revival in the Church of Scotland. And out of that revival in the Church of Scotland, there came a man by the name of Robert Haldane. And Robert Haldane was a well-educated, pious layman who was very concerned about the state of the church. He was very concerned about carrying the gospel to parts of the world where it had never been heard. He was concerned that the Church of Scotland didn't seem adequately concerned about the truth and about the lost. And so Robert Haldane would embark on a career that would be very influential and significant in terms of writing and speaking and carrying the gospel. And one of the places he carried the gospel in 1816 was to Geneva. The Church of Geneva had also fallen on hard times after the French Enlightenment. It too had drifted away from orthodoxy, and it too was in need of a revival. And so Robert Haldane set himself up in a sort of coffee shop across the street from the theological faculty in Geneva, and would gather students from what we would call the seminary in Geneva to just sit around in the coffee shop and talk about the Bible. Now, I don't know if he bought the coffee. He was a Scotsman after all, so probably students had to buy their own coffee. But they would study the Bible together, and that study of the Bible led to a real revival in the church in Geneva. And one of the young men significantly impacted by that work of Haldane there in Geneva was a man by the name of Merle Daubigny. For a time, Daubigny was famous as a writer of the history of the Reformation. He wrote some very interesting and powerful books about the history of the Reformation, but he was particularly a preacher, and he went around Europe preaching. And one of the places that he went and preached was in the Netherlands. And his preaching in the Netherlands led to a revival in the Dutch Reformed Church. Now you see how amazing are these interconnections. A Scotsman going to Geneva, having an impact, that leads to a preacher going to the Netherlands and preaching and having an impact there. So we're beginning to see fires being lit in various churches in Europe. In Scotland, that revival would continue in Scotland and would lead to some very prominent preachers that were very concerned about both the spiritual and the social health of Scotland, and would give rise to one of the great men of the century in Scotland, Thomas Chalmers, who was a great preacher of the gospel and of Orthodox Calvinist truth, but also very concerned about the poor in Glasgow and wanting to improve the conditions under which the working poor lived. And this led to really a great renewal in the Church of Scotland, and ultimately led to what came to be known as the disruption in the Church of Scotland. An insistence on the part of conservatives in the Church of Scotland that they ought to be free, that they ought to be able to serve the Lord according to their conscience, that they ought not to be excessively controlled by the Parliament. And the disruption which took place in the 1840s, Chalmers, one of the leaders, led to the formation of the Free Church of Scotland, which became one of the great missionary churches of the 19th century. And so you see these amazing fires being lit of faithfulness and of commitment. And as I said, one of those places was in the Netherlands. And In particular, the impact in the Netherlands of Merle d'Aubigné's preaching was initially, of course, among French-speaking people, some of the more well-educated and people of real influence in the Netherlands. And a poet was converted, a Jew was converted. They began to have a greater and greater influence in society. And then that fire reached a fellow by the name, this is one of my favorite Dutch names, a fellow by the name of Guillaume Groen van Prinsterer. Dutch names are a marvel. Dutchmen, except the nobility, and he actually was part of the nobility, Dutchmen didn't have last names until Napoleon conquered the Netherlands. And Napoleon insisted that Dutch people take last names. And many Dutch people were really annoyed by this, so they decided if the French are going to make us have last names, we're going to have completely unpronounceable last names. And so many of them adopted very long last names just to sort of annoy the French. And then some of the Dutchmen took names Van something or other, and their neighbors thought they were putting on airs like German noblemen with Vons. And so one of the families took the name Zondervan, which meant without a van. So you had all these crazy names. And I think maybe Napoleon had the last laugh. But anyway, Groen van Prinsterer was part of the really ruling elite of the Netherlands in the 19th century. He was a very distinguished man, a very thoughtful man. He was part of the cabinet of the King of the Netherlands. The Kingdom of the Netherlands had been established after the defeat of Napoleon by the Congress of Vienna in 1815. And he was part of that cabinet. His wife was converted by the preaching of Merle d'Aubigné and Willem Bilderdijk. And then Van Prinsterer was converted. And this was kind of an embarrassment, you know, in royal circles. He became kind of fanatical about this Calvinism stuff. So they gave him the new job, no longer in the cabinet, of archivist of the House of Orange for the royal family in the Netherlands. They, you know, put him in the library, kind of in the rare book collection on the shelf. But he used that place as an opportunity to study Dutch history and to really learn about the coming of Calvinism, the character of Calvinism. And he became convinced that the insights of Calvinism were what was needed by not only the Dutch church, but also the Dutch society in the conditions in which it found itself. So he founded a political party. Political parties in the Netherlands in the middle of the 19th century were really not like political parties as we think about them. They were really kind of discussion clubs. There was nothing of a mass movement about it. And Van Prinsterer established the political party that in English we would call the Anti-Revolutionary Party. Maybe not quite the positive note you'd want to strike with a political party if you were, you know, an advertising executive today, but this is exactly what Van Prinsterer thought was necessary for Dutch society in his day. It was the spirit of the French Revolution that was corrupting Europe, Van Prinsterer believed. And so Christians ought to stand as anti-revolutionaries, stand against the unbelief of the French Revolution, stand against the social leveling of the French Revolution, but to do so in the name of a more Christian, a more just society. Van Prinsterer was not simply someone in favor of the status quo. He believed there needed to be changes in society, that particularly the poor and the workers needed more help, more encouragement, and so he started this political party. He soon became known as the general without an army because he got elected to Parliament, but he was the only anti-revolutionary member of Parliament. It was not a movement that initially was likely to take off and be terribly influential until the movement attracted a young man of extraordinary talents and abilities, Abraham Kuyper. Now, I don't know what you know about Abraham Kuyper. I would argue, and there'd be plenty of people who'd argue with me, but I would argue that Abraham Kuyper is the most important Christian thinker in the modern era. Now, that's a big claim, but you've already learned by this class that I'm always right, or at least think I am. Abraham Kuyper was maybe not the greatest theologian of the modern period. Abraham Kuyper certainly wasn't right about everything he had to say. Not all of what Abraham Kuyper did in the Netherlands is easily transferable to other times and places, but I think Abraham Kuyper was the most creatively reflective Christian trying to come to grips with the modern world. And that's why I think it's worth taking some time to follow his career and to think about him. Now, what do I mean by that? For a long time in the 19th and on into the 20th century, most Christians really longed to go back to the time of the Reformation, to go back to a medieval world where Christianity was established in law, where it was dominant over society. A lot of Christians just didn't like the modern world and wanted to go back. You know, the book of Ecclesiastes reminds us, he who's always talking about the golden age of the past is a fool. We don't live in the past. The past was never as good as we think it was anyway. But we don't live in the past, we live in the present. And I think Abraham Kuyper was the most insightful and most creative Christian thinker who tried to think through, what does it mean to be a Christian in the West living in a world where we're no longer in charge as Christians? What does that mean for us? How do we adjust to that? Another way of putting that is to say Kuyper took seriously that Christianity in the West had been disestablished. Remember, that was one of the issues we talked about early on. Are we going to try to establish Christianity law and make its prominence, its domination of Western society permanent in law, or are we going to come to grips with the fact we've been disestablished? Because what Kuyper saw is that even though the Reformed Church in the Netherlands was somewhat established, it wasn't being entirely faithful. And so Kuyper, as those in Scotland wrestled with, what good does it do to have an established church if it's not a faithful biblical church? And so Kuyper began to try to think about what would it actually mean for Christians to function in a world where they weren't in charge. Now, I don't want to shock you, but here in America, we're not in charge anymore. And that's why he's such an important thinker for us. What should be our goals? What should be the way we're going to relate to the world around us? And I think Kuyper helps us more than any other Christian thinker in the modern period to try to think things through. So who was this Abraham Kuyper? Well, he was the son of a minister in the State Reformed Church. His father is always described as having been mildly Orthodox. That always confuses me. What does it mean to be mildly Orthodox? I think what it means is he was personally Orthodox, but not a fighter. Kind of live and let live. His own ministry was Orthodox, but he wasn't overly troubled what was going on in the church as a whole. So Kuyper was born into a ministerial family in 1837. When he was a boy, his father was called to the church at Leiden, which was one of the important cities, one of the cultural centers of the Netherlands. There was a great university there in Leiden, and that's the university that young Abraham would come to attend. And he soon was seen to be a student of extraordinary talent, of extraordinary ability. He went through university, and then he went through the School of Theology, and then he got a doctoral degree writing on John Calvin and John Olasco. I'm running out of room on the board. I don't know where David is to erase the board. John Olasco was the reformer of Poland. We forget at one time there was a large Reformed church in Poland. And Kuyper studied intensively the writings of Olasco and of Calvin, and it really laid a vital foundation for his whole later career, that as a student he had spent so much time studying, reading Calvin and Olasco. Then he entered the ministry, being called in 1863 to a little village church. And when he arrived there, by his own testimony, he was not yet converted. And he said it used to be very hard to write sermons. When you don't know exactly what you believe, it's extraordinarily difficult to write sermons. And he had been warned that there were some folks in that village who were just difficult. They never liked the minister. And Kuyper was told, just ignore them. Don't pay any attention to them. And Kuyper, as a kind of idealistic young minister, thought, no, I've got to be a pastor of all the people in this village. And so he tried to visit these people. First, they were very unfriendly, very resistant, and he finally got them to talk, and they said they were tired of having unconverted ministers, that they were real Calvinists, and that the ministers never fed them spiritually, and that they largely just stayed home and they read old Calvinist Dutch writers. Kuyper said, well, what old Calvinist Dutch writers do you read? And they said, well, John Owen and William Perkins, and these people were so simple, they didn't know that these were English Puritans they were reading, but they'd been translated into Dutch, and they had Dutch versions of these English Puritans, and they had watered their souls really probably for generations through these writings. And Kuyper was so intrigued by the piety of these people that it led to his conversion. And his conversion then really empowered him to become a very powerful preacher, because he already knew the Bible, he already knew Calvin. It wasn't he had to learn all of these things, he'd already learned them, but he hadn't believed them. And now he believed them and saw the power of them, and began to preach with a new power. He was soon called from this little village to the city of Utrecht, which was a very prominent, large city in the Netherlands, and later would be called from Utrecht to Amsterdam, the largest city in the Netherlands. And so his career as a preacher was becoming very significant, and he began to write. Began to write about the state of the church in his day. He began to write about what ought to be done in the church in his day. And he began to say already in Utrecht, we must reform the church or move out. And this was pretty shocking. But something even more shocking happened in 1874. He concluded that he should leave the ministry to pursue a career in politics. Now, for many Dutch Reformed people, for a minister, a dominee, that's the word for pastor, for a dominee to leave the ministry is kind of like a man leaving his wife. It's a betrayal of your essential calling. And it was very hard for some to reconcile themselves to Kuyper leaving the ministry, but he was not leaving the church. He became an elder in the church. In the Dutch Constitution, you couldn't serve in Parliament if you were a minister. So he had to leave the ministry to run for Parliament. He'd come to know Groen van Prinster, and Van Prinster had influenced him to think, we really need a Christian testimony, not just in the church, but in the broader social, political realm. And Kuyper thought only outside of the ministry could he accomplish that. And then he began to give himself to incredible breadth of labors. He continued to write a great deal. He became the editor of 2 newspapers, one of them a daily newspaper. He ran for Parliament, was elected to Parliament. And then he concluded the Netherlands needed a new university, so he helped found the Free University of Amsterdam and became a professor at the Free University of Amsterdam, teaching a wide range of subjects. Because part of the brilliance of Abraham Kuyper is he came to recognize that it's not enough to have ideas, but ideas have to have institutional expression. And he became convinced that the institutions that needed to carry his ideas were the institutions of a new church. He would eventually found a new Reformed denomination with others. I mean, he's not all alone in this. He would found periodicals, he would found a university, he would found a labor movement, he would turn the anti-revolutionary party into a real mass political party, and he would eventually get himself elected Prime Minister of the Netherlands. This was a man not only of ideas, but this was a man who could put ideas into action in building institutions, and a man who could not only speak to the most scholarly of people, but it also could communicate very effectively to common people. That's part of what he had learned as a preacher. How do you connect with what was basically a lot of blue-collar people? The Orthodox Reformed people in those days in the Netherlands were by and large blue-collar people. They were not well-educated people. They were faithful, humble, dedicated people. And Kuyper, by his writing, by his preaching, by his speaking, was able to rally these people into a remarkable force in Dutch life in the very late 19th century and early 20th century. And that's what led to him eventually actually being able to be elected prime minister. Part of his goal there was that, and part of the political rallying cry, was that the government ought to allow Christians to have Christian schools for their children, and government ought to pay for it. It was unfair that taxes ought to pay for public schools and then Christians had to pay for Christian schools separately. So that was a big part of his rallying cry, that we need a free nation and a free church and free schools where the children of believers can be educated. And out of this remarkable man's life and work and his institution building, a lot of things in Dutch society were changed, but they were changed not just because he built institutions, but because he had clear, new, challenging, modern ideas of how Christians were going to relate to the world around about them. And it's to those ideas then will come in the next lecture, to see what it was that Kuyper articulated so powerfully, that rallied so many people, that changed Dutch society, but still are very valuable for us to think about in the world in which we live. Thank you.